So as you've heard all morning long, and as you already know from the work that's been happening in our system, you know that at FCPS we encourage our students to become communicators, collaborators, creative and critical thinkers, goal-directed and resilient individuals, and ethical and global citizens. And we must demand the same of ourselves. It's through an awareness of ourselves that we build the capacity to expand our teaching practices in new and innovative ways, those innovative ways in which we've been talking about and will continue to talk about today moving forward. At the forefront of this thinking of how we can overhaul the function and focus of our schools to truly prepare our students for success in the 21st century is Dr. Tony Wagner. Tony currently serves as an expert in residence at the Harvard University Innovation Lab. Prior to this appointment, Tony was the first Innovation Education Fellow at the Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at Harvard and the founder and co-director of the Change Leadership Group at Harvard, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for more than a decade. His previous work experience includes 12 years as a high school teacher, a K-8 principal, a university professor in teacher education, and the founding executive director of Educators for Social Responsibility. Tony is a frequent speaker at national and international conferences and is a widely published author. His work, of which I know you are very familiar, includes numerous articles and several books. Tony's latest, Most Likely to Succeed, Preparing Our Kids for the Innovation Era, co-authored by Ted Dintersmith, was published by Scribner, and many of you I know have a copy of this book in preparation for the conference today. We're also very excited about the opportunity that you've heard of later on and that Tony will talk a little bit about, the opportunity to view the documentary. Tony served as the strategic education advisor for that documentary, which had its world premiere at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival, and it's going to be shown right here, as I mentioned, this afternoon at approximately 1:40. Tony earned his master's and doctorate at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and we are thrilled to welcome Tony Wagner back to Fairfax County Public Schools.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just a pleasure to be back with you this morning and to see some good old friends like Jack Dale. Retirement does suit him, doesn't it? Looks great. Tooling around the countryside in his Porsche. Oh, man. You know, I'm really excited to share with you some of the things I've learned since I was last here. Seems like a world away now, as well as to expand on some of the comments that Dr. Garza made. I began my teaching career, it's kind of a bit of a homecoming for me. I began my teaching career 35 years ago, just across the river in Montgomery County, working with at-risk students in a high school within a school. And at that time, we talked a lot about the dawn of the knowledge economy, and that we were going to need all kinds of knowledge workers. It was the twilight zone of the industrial era. A lot of people still talk about a knowledge economy today, but it's increasingly clear to me that's not what we have. Computers increasingly collect, analyze, aggregate, and disseminate the knowledge that we use overwhelmingly. Computers do a lot of other things too, and we're going to increasingly see more and more artificial intelligence taking more and more jobs away. There's no longer a competitive advantage in knowing more than the person next to you, because Google knows everything. The world simply no longer cares how much you know. What the world cares about is what you can do with what you know, because we now live in the innovation era. Your theme for the day, Ignite Innovation, couldn't be more important or more appropriate, but we need to explore it. We need to understand it. One of the immediate implications of the innovation era is that more and more employers don't trust college transcripts, don't trust degrees, certificates. They think they're certificates of seat time mastery, seat time served, not a certificate of mastery. couple of interesting examples. Google used to only hire graduates from Ivy League schools with the highest GPAs, highest test scores. Well, along comes Laszlo Bock, analyzes the data as senior VP, and discovers that the indices they've been using to hire people for years are, quote, worthless. No correlation. He goes on to say, the skills you need to succeed in a competitive academic environment bear absolutely no relationship to the skills you need to succeed in the innovation era. Right now, today, 15% of Google's new hires do not have a college degree at all. The word college does not even appear on their job website, and they no longer ask for a transcript. They're using structured interviews, qualitative research and data to understand students' capacities to innovate. Well, I thought, well, that's Google, you know, West Coast. They're always doing things a little oddly. But then I was in Ho Chi Minh City 3 years ago at the invitation of Deloitte, the accounting and consulting firm. I was talking to the CEO before my presentation to area business leaders, and she kind of looked at me. She said, you know, we used to hire the best students from the best universities. Kind of looking at me. She said, but we don't do that anymore because it turns out, she said, they don't work out so well. Now, she says, what we do is look for good students and we put them through a summer-long boot camp to see how they solve problems collaboratively. The latest, Penguin, the distinguished publishing company in Great Britain, just announced you no longer have to have a BA degree to apply for a job at Penguin. What we're seeing is more and more employers who understand that it's not about what you know, it's about what you can do. This is already beginning to dramatically affect our jobs market for our recent graduates in ways that may not be as apparent as it should. You know, we read all the wonderful monthly reports about new jobs created and so on, but what few people really explore and understand is what are the quality of those jobs that are being produced. Guess what the percentages of un- and underemployed of our recent college graduates is? 45% of our recent college graduates are un- or underemployed. Now, what does that mean, underemployed? It means kids who are BA Ristas or BA bartenders. Yeah, you got it. Kids who have BA degrees earning barely more than minimum wage and unable to repay an average of $33,000 of college debt. Now, I'm not arguing against going to college. I'm not a Peter Thiel fan here. But what I am saying is that college and that diploma no longer guarantees you a good job. What does? What does in the innovation era? More importantly, what is innovation and how do we prepare kids? That's been the sort of focus of my work now for the last half dozen years, trying to understand what is innovation and what must we do differently as parents, as teachers, and as employers to prepare kids for the innovation era. Well, first of all, let's talk about what is innovation. I discovered there are two kinds of innovation, broadly speaking. There are innovations that are all about bringing new possibilities to life. Now, that's fairly rare. Like a Steve Jobs, it's an extraordinary a collision of a particular talent at a particular time in history. That's more a matter of nature than nurture. Not Steve Jobs is born every day. But then there's another kind of innovation that's at least as important, and that's creative problem solving. Creative problem solving not just in STEM, but in every domain, in the humanities, in social services. Creative problem solving in third world countries. Creative problem solving in the civic arena. Now here's the good news. We are born curious, creative, imaginative. That's the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day. Jack's grandchildren, right? They do that. And most young kindergartners think of themselves as artists all the time. But then something happens. We call it school. The longer kids are in school, the fewer questions they ask, the less curious they appear. the more preoccupied they are with getting the right answers. And as kids get older, fewer and fewer think of themselves as artists in any domain. So what must we do differently? To answer that question, I started interviewing a wide variety of young innovators, all in their 20s. Some were in STEM fields, some were social innovators, social entrepreneurs, some were in the arts, some were from privilege, some were from poverty. And since then, I've interviewed young innovators all over the world. But with this particular first set, I wanted to more deeply understand what had most influenced them. So I interviewed all of their parents, see if I could discern patterns of parenting. And indeed I did. I asked them, of course, about their education, and that led to my first very troubling discovery. You see, some of these kids had gone to our best universities: Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon. But in every single case, they told me they'd become innovators in spite of their good schooling, not because of it. But I probed, I pushed. I said, well, can you tell me about a teacher who's made a real difference in your lives, like some of those teachers and others in that tape this morning? And everyone could name at least one teacher. And the grade range taught by those teachers was first grade to graduate school. So I went and interviewed every single one of those teachers and watched many of them teach, again, to see if I could find a pattern. And I did find a pattern, and that led to my second very troubling discovery. You see, in every single case, all of those teachers were outliers in their education settings, teaching in ways that were fundamentally different than their peers, yet remarkably similar to one another, I discovered as I traveled around the country. Then I spent time observing and interviewing in those few schools that really do teach innovation. And it didn't take me long, because there aren't that many. But I went to the brand new MIT Media Lab, the Olin College of Engineering, the D School at Stanford, High Tech High, which will be in the film this afternoon, New Tech High, Expeditionary School, Learning Schools, Reggio Emilia classrooms, Montessori classrooms, the Bing Nursery School on the campus of Stanford, and again saw a pattern, a remarkable pattern of learning and teaching across those institutions and grade levels that was entirely consistent with what my outlier teachers were doing. And that led me to understand that there are a set of very fundamental contradictions between the traditional culture of schooling, now a century old, and the culture of learning to be a creative problem solver. And these are contradictions that we must grapple with in our new work as educators. Contradiction number one are all of the ways in which conventional schools celebrate and reward individual achievement. Well, that's fine. There's certainly a place for that. But the problem is, innovation is a team sport. There is no innovation without deep collaboration and real teamwork. None of this one kid on the team doing all the work. Knowing this, these teachers created team-based, peer-accountable projects in every single course. They evaluated students' abilities to work in a team as much as individually. And most importantly, they team-taught whenever possible. You know, I think one of the reasons we have so little innovation in education is because we are so profoundly isolated as educators in our day-to work. Isolation is the enemy of improvement. Isolation is the enemy of innovation. The second contradiction has to do with all of the ways in which we compartmentalize knowledge according to a scheme that's, again, about a century old, and we favor specialization. Now, again, there's certainly a role for specialization and deep knowledge. But here's the problem. What I learned is that innovations happen at the boundaries of academic disciplines, never within them. Knowing this, these teachers organized interdisciplinary courses around a big question or a real problem that needed solving. Contradiction three is the culture of the classroom. Culture of the classroom in conventional schooling is so much a culture of passivity, a culture of consumption, consuming information, giving it back. It's a culture ultimately often of a kind of infantilization, because there's only one person in the room doing all the talking or having anything worth hearing, supposedly. Radically different is the culture of a classroom that focuses on learning creative problem solving. Because the emphasis there is on creating, not consuming. It's on acquiring knowledge just in time to solve a real problem or grapple with a big question. It's a culture where the teacher sees his or her role as much more than just an expert, a sage on the stage, much more than just a facilitator, but rather a coach, a performance coach, coaching students to higher performance standards. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all for us. Contradiction 4, you see, is all about the F word in schools. Failure. Worst thing that can happen in school. Horrible thing. Fear of failure, I think, drives not only a culture of compliance, but a culture of real risk aversion. And it's as much for teachers as it is for kids. We too are afraid of failing in front of our peers, in front of parents and kids. But let's look at this, because you see, innovation demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and that you fail. I went to IDEO, the most innovative design company in the world. They talk about failing often. I talk about other companies that talk about failing fast, failing forward, failing cheap, but failing. Now, they're not really talking about failing in an academic sense, not in the school sense. They're talking about a process that is called iteration, my new favorite word. I didn't know that word 8 years ago, but that's at the heart of innovation, iteration, moving from 1.0 to 2.0. And iteration, the process of trial and error, is in fact how we really learn as human beings. How many of you learn more from your mistakes than your successes? Raise your hands. Right. You can bet Dr. Garza made a few mistakes putting that water rower together and had to iterate to solve the problem. But we don't allow that in schools. What if we said to kids, infants, I'm sorry, you cannot walk until you can walk in a straight line across that stage. None of this crawling business, falling down stuff, can't have it. And you certainly can't talk until you can talk in complete sentences, no mumbling and muttering. Oh, and bicycle riding, completely out of the question, because we know you're going to fall and skin your knee. We learn through trial and error. And that's how we have to transform schools. The teachers whom I met in these creative problem-solving courses and so on assessed students according to a body of work and assessed progress over time towards certain clear performance standards. And they didn't use conventional grading either, nor do I. The only grades I can justify are A, B, or incomplete. A B is my performance standard for my students. It's the same for every student. Now, it may take some kids more time, they may need more support, but the performance standard remains the same. An A should be reserved for real human excellence, very rare. I consider a student's work incomplete until they've met the standard. The only failure I acknowledge is the failure not to show up, not to try at all. How many want to fly with a C- airline pilot? Raise your hands. No, that's not the way the adult world works. You know? You're expected to be competent, you're expected to be good, none of this plus and minus stuff. So that's a challenge. How do we do that in schools? The last contradiction is the contradiction around motivation. You know, I think it's the skeleton in the closet. We talked all about these learning standards and pushing kids and testing and so on. What we rarely talk about is how do we motivate and inspire students? If we really want them to do their best work, how do we engage them? We rely so heavily, I think, on extrinsic incentives to motivate learning. Carrots and sticks, rewards for good grades, fear of failure. But when I went and interviewed these young people, went back and looked at the data, that's not what motivated them. They were far, far more intrinsically motivated. Over and over again, I learned they did their best work in school not to get an A, but because it was work worth doing. It was interesting work. And when they went out to look for jobs, they wanted jobs where they could make a difference, where they could make a contribution. And money was very, very secondary to them. Yes, they're impatient, but they're impatient to have responsibility to make a difference. And I found that all over the world with so many of these millennials. So I went back and I tried to understand what did those parents and teachers do to continue to nurture this intrinsic motivation that we're born with. What did they do that was different? And I found a pattern. Both parents and teachers explicitly encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraged much more exploratory play, fewer toys, toys without batteries. They limited screen time. Teachers tried to bring a spirit of play into their classroom. It was Ed Carrier, who teaches engineering students at Stanford, who talked with me about how he brings an element of what he calls whimsy into his thinking about how to design projects for his teams of students. One of the outlier teachers. An engineering teacher talking about whimsy. As these kids grew older, the parents were very intentional, according to their means, in trying to introduce their children to new interests, new possibilities, to keep that curiosity, that spark alive. They valued students finding and pursuing a real interest no matter what, more than academic achievement for its own sake, because they intuitively understood something researchers are now just beginning to say, which is that, number one, grit matters enormously. Perseverance, self-regulation, self-discipline matters more than IQ. And number two, you best learn grit not from a tiger mom sitting on your shoulder yelling at you to practice 10,000 hours, but from the pursuit of a real interest. Now, the interesting thing is that some of these parents took real risks. I remember talking to the parents of in the medical profession whose daughter's passion was art. And they were privately terrified that she'd be living a home the rest of her life as a starving artist, right? But they didn't say that. What they did was turn a spare bedroom into an artist studio. Well, she went on to be a senior executive at Autodesk, writing and developing simulation software to train first responders. As these kids grew older, their passions morphed and evolved. But in every case, they matured to a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to give back and to make a difference. And I discovered that is because their parents and teachers had explicitly encouraged one simple lesson, one simple idea. The idea that we are not here on this earth just to serve ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and to make a difference. You know this as educators. Your profession is a profession, but it is also a calling. We saw that in the inspiring videos this morning. So let me explore briefly a couple of the implications, perhaps for your district, of some of the things I've learned. Then I'm going to show a short clip from the documentary you're going to see this afternoon. It's actually not in the documentary, it's an outtake, which I'll explain in a moment. Give you a little time to talk to each other, and then have some Q&A. But just a couple of thoughts about some implications. First of all, I want to start with commending you for all the things you're already doing right. Your portrait of a graduate is fantastic. It's superb. And the way it was developed with all kinds of shareholders, not stakeholders, I call them shareholders, having a conversation and a voice is wonderful. Your next set of challenges of developing the assessments of those outcomes is critically important, and I know you're already embarked on that. You're already talking about capstone projects. You're already talking about every student having a digital portfolio, every student collecting a body of work that is evidence of mastery of core competencies. I push you and encourage you to think about a high school diploma as a genuine certificate of mastery, not a certificate of seat time served. Think about it as a collection of merit badges in communication skills, merit badges in all of the other 3 C's, communication, critical thinking, collaboration, and creative problem solving. And that in particular I know to be a special challenge for you. How do you assess creativity and creative problem solving? Well, I believe the talent that is in this room and the talent that you represent in your schools, you will figure this out. You will be the national leaders of how to assess the skills that matter most in the 21st century. That is your challenge. That is your opportunity for national leadership. But let me bring it back to the school level and to the classroom level. How do you lead change successfully? It's been a focus of my work for a long time before writing The Global Achievement Gap. It seems to me even more important now than ever to just make a couple of comments on this. And I know Ken Kay has written a wonderful book about the steps towards leading a district or a school in this direction. And we agree that you begin as a change leader by throwing away some old assumptions about what it means to be a leader. Our traditional assumptions about leaders are that they have all the answers, right? You get to be a leader, you get to be promoted because you have better answers than other people. I talked to Brad Anderson, retired CEO of Best Buy. I said, what's the #1 obstacle to innovation when you were CEO? He said, my senior management. I said, why? He said, because they think they got promoted because they're smarter than anybody else and they stopped listening. The job of a change leader is not to provide the answers, but to frame the problems and the challenges. That's your job. Your job is first and foremost to create understanding and urgency for change, to lead adult learning, to understand this changing world, to help your teachers and parents and your kids understand all of the ways in which we live in the innovation era and what that era is going to demand of them for work, for learning, and for citizenship. So yes, you are learner-in-chief, framing the right challenges, getting on the balcony, as Ron Heifetz says, and helping others see the bigger picture. They need that help, parents and teachers alike, kids too. Then the next challenge, I think, is to really inspire and engage your shareholders in figuring out how to solve the challenges and the problems you've identified. You can't do it. You can't possibly do it. They can. They will, if you give them the resources. And that leads me to one thing you may specifically want to consider. You know, and this is particularly for your board, but it's for all of you in this district. Think about innovation. Where does it come from? Well, its source, as Dr. Garza suggested, is R&D, research and development. Now, you look at the R&D budgets of corporations. They range from lows, and like a manufacturing company like 3M, a 6% R&D budget, all the way up to 20+% in Google. What's your R&D budget in your schools? It's a trick question. You probably don't have one, or if you do, it's buried as a line item and not known by your teachers. So here's my suggestion to you. Take a portion of your professional development budget, raise some additional funds. Every school should have an R&D budget, an innovation fund, not like the Apple Teacher Fund, an innovation fund to which teams of teachers can apply. And you set parameters. You say, we want more interdisciplinary courses. We want more collaboration across departments. We want to see more performance-based assessment. We want to explore a portfolio-based assessment. We want to see more capstone projects. So you throw out a half a dozen things that you think are promising new possibilities, pointing in the direction of how we're going to do this work of assessment. And you invite teams of teachers, not individuals. Let me be clear, that's the difference. Teams will iterate more quickly and take more responsible risks together than any one of them will alone. But you invite teams of teachers to engage in R&D and then to share that work. That's a way of igniting and encouraging your early adopters. It's a way of keeping some of your most talented educators who might otherwise leave. But what about the classroom? Let me suggest one other idea. How many of you know what Google time is? Raise your hands. Yeah. Well, the idea that was introduced at Google, and it's actually used widely in other companies, is to give employees a percentage of time to work on any project of their choice. Google, it's 20% time. The equivalent of a day a week, permission to play on projects of your choice. And it's led to most of the most interesting and exciting tools we use from Google every single day. Because it turns out if you're passionate about a project, you're going to spend more time working on it. You're going to be thinking about it all the time. 3M, been doing this for years and years. How many of you use Post-it notes? Raise your hands. That's an engineer who's got permission to play with a failed glue. They said, here, maybe you can figure out something to do with this. He was so excited about this project. He said, it must be something to do with a glue that doesn't quite stick. He figured it out. So what if We said to every student, you're going to have a part of your school day or week or year to be the architect of your own learning. And we explained to them about Google Time and innovations. Could be, a period at the end of the week, maybe a mini-mester between 2 semesters. Lots of ways to do it. Lots of teachers are already doing it. Could be 5% of the time. It doesn't have to be 20%. It's not free time, because students are going to be asked to explain what they're going to do and report back, maybe keep track of their learning through their digital portfolios, not for grade, but for credit. And it's simply credit, no credit, not pass-fail. I don't like that term. Credit, no credit. Maybe that's a way to start creative problem solving. Google Time is for creative problem solving. So I've had some emails from teachers who heard me suggest this. Share 2 with you. 5th grade teacher told her students, I'm not going to give you any more academic homework on weekends. Explain Google Time, explain innovation, blah, blah, blah. She said, you're going to be the architect of your own learning on weekends. So first weekend she did this. She didn't know what to expect. Students came back on Monday. She asked them to report out. One girl who was from Chinese family but knew nothing about China history, culture, nothing, spent the entire weekend researching everything she could about China. Another student wanted to learn to play a musical instrument, spent the whole weekend on YouTube videos and beginning to play. Nobody told him to practice. Another student wanted to learn to cook, spent the whole weekend cooking, exploring different cookbooks. And she said she had never seen so much excitement in that classroom, in that 5th grade class. High school English teacher emailed me, trying this out Friday afternoons, last period of the day, group of mixed students. He gave them Google Time, explained it. When he explained it and announced it, the kids in the front row, the ones who always have their hands up, they just kind of looked at each other. They looked at him. They scratched their heads. And one of them said, but aren't you going to tell us what to do? Kids in the back went crazy. They had all kinds of ideas of things to do. He said that whole experience has forced him to rethink how he understands and evaluates his students and who is a good student and what does that mean. Well, so what does this look like in a classroom? I'm going to take you into a 9th grade class at High Tech High. High Tech High is a charter school district, actually, 12 schools, 5,000 kids, plus its own graduate school of education. High Tech High is an unusual charter in the sense that it admits students by lottery by zip code. Very important. San Diego, representative of every zip code zone in San Diego, which means it's 65% minority, 45% free and reduced lunch, K-12. Some things are very different about High Tech High. First of all, they have slightly less per student allocations than do the public schools in the city. They don't have a lot of money. Every class is team taught. Almost all classes are interdisciplinary, project-based, and team-based. All students have to regularly present and defend work. All students do a semester-long work-based internship in 11th grade as a requirement for graduation. All students do a team-based service learning project in senior year as another requirement for graduation. So I'm going to invite you to look at this 5-minute clip. 9th grade class, taught by 2 teachers. I want you to look and listen for 3 things. First of all, what content knowledge is being taught? This is not content versus skills. I'm going to be clear. Content knowledge still matters. A few years ago, kids heard on the radio that the Russians had invaded Georgia. They were afraid South Carolina would be next. True story. True story. So content knowledge still matters, but in the innovation era, skills matter more, and motivation matters most. Because if you are self-motivated, if you stay curious, you will continuously acquire new content knowledge and new skills your entire life. So look and listen for what content knowledge is being taught, what skills are being taught, and how are students being motivated to learn. And then after we show the clip, I'm going to invite you to spend 3 or 4 minutes at your seats, just debriefing what you've seen and heard this morning, and developing questions for the time we will have for Q&A. And I think you already know you submit them through your app, right? Something like that. Okay, so we're going to go straight from the film to time for you at your seats to pair share, and then come back with you for some Q&A. Look forward to it. So I'm looking forward to your questions. This is my favorite part of the presentation because I can hear myself anytime, but I really want your questions and comments. So bring them on. What should my first step be to change mindsets of the community and embrace innovation learning practices? I think we first must understand and appreciate the fact that change is scary. Change represents risk. And we have to help people understand there are competing risks here. It's not as if one way is safe and the other way is not. The risk that we take by not changing is that our kids leave school unprepared for work, for learning, or for citizenship in the 21st century. And I think the first job of a change leader is to create that understanding and urgency for change by helping the adults in your communities understand this changing world. I think that's the reason why we're going to show the Most Likely to Succeed film this afternoon. And you may want to consider showing it in your schools as well, to help folks understand this changing world. Living in the midst of change, it's very hard to understand. And especially for teachers who are focused, as they should be, on their kids every day. But for parents too. So I think that's the first thing to do. Ways central offices can support the type of learning I described. You know, I'm sure you have funds like for Apple and so on, but I really am taken with this idea of an innovation fund. Scarsdale schools have done it. And they found that when they put a kind of a request for proposals out there for innovations related to the themes we've been talking this morning, they got stunning proposals, K-12. So I think that's a start central offices might consider. You know, it's no fun when I don't get to hear people ask the questions. I'm just kind of reading them. It's kind of boring. Huh? No, they're not boring questions. Percentage of students at high-tech high require provided special education. Higher than San Diego. I think it's 14%. Oh, I'll give you a couple other stats since you asked. You know it's 45% free and reduced, 65% minority. 98% of high-tech high kids go to college. 98%. Last year, Stanford took more high-tech high kids than any other non-legacy high school. Oh, and by the way, they don't offer any AP courses whatsoever. You don't need AP to get those results. But, you know, that used to be my throwaway line because I'm not a fan of, you know, stuffing the goose. But, and I used to teach AP, so I have rights to say that. But having said that, and not being a fan of AP content courses, the AP Capstone Seminar new course, a 2-year interdisciplinary course on skills of research and collaboration is fantastic. It's completely content-free. There is no testing of content. It is entirely skills-based. So I encourage you to look at that. But back to the high-tech high numbers, 98% graduate, but we know nationally only half of every class that starts college finishes any degree at all, half. Well, 4 years later, 86% of high-tech high students had either graduated or were still in college, 86%. Keeping in mind they're overwhelmingly minority and half are poor. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, it's jiggling around. Oh, I get to follow the needle. What's going on? How do you ensure all content is addressed when project-directed learning may take more time? Here's the fallacy of content, guys. Got to tell you. You want to be embarrassed as teachers? Go ask your kids 6 months after the course is over to retake the test. Lawrenceville did that with a group of teachers. Kids had taken AP courses in May were asked voluntarily if they'd come back and take the same exam in September. Not one passed. Not one. So the problem is content knowledge in most cases goes in one ear and out the other. Chinese knew this several thousand years ago. They said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So this is not content knowledge versus projects. This is using rich and challenging content to engage in worthwhile work, project-based work. Understanding we are going to give up some content knowledge. But if we continue to nurture kids' curiosity and continue to give them the skills for learning, they'll acquire the new content knowledge just in time, when they need it, as indeed we do as adults. So feel free to give up some of that content knowledge that kids are going to forget anyway. What do we got here? Parents to understand, problem solving. How do we get parents to understand this? Here's a question that's fun to ask an audience, any audience. Describe a time when you were most engaged as a learner, in school, out of school. Just when were you most engaged as a learner? The answer will often surprise you. Rarely is it listening to a lecture. Well, present company accepted, of course, but I didn't mean that. But seriously, it's when we're doing stuff or when we're pursuing a passion. So parents intuitively understand this, they just haven't acknowledged that they know it. What else we got here, besides very little time? Advice for how we best influence state and national policy. I think that's a wonderful question. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Garza that the assessments we use are totally obsolete. They're a 20th century tool solving a 20th century problem. And I really challenge you to become the national leaders of 21st century assessments. So I think your work will speak volumes. Beyond that, I would urge you to push your state to be one of the 7 that will be allowed waivers under the new ESSA law to use performance-based assessments in lieu of standardized tests. New Hampshire's been doing this for 2 years. They have something called the PACE program. 8 districts are involved in a pilot that replaces a number of standardized tests with performance-based assessments. So go to your states, your state reps, your education leadership, which I gather has changed for the better, and push them. Push them to be a part of this cadre, really doing educational R&D for accountability 2.0. That's what we have to ask for. We're not asking for less accountability. We're asking for a higher, better accountability. Accountability for what matters most. And we have to keep getting that message out to parents, to teachers, to business leaders. It's accountability 2.0. No company in the world uses rubrics and measures of performance improvements that are 25 years old. None, not one. They've all evolved. They have to. As the nature of the work evolves, the assessment has to evolve. So I also think we need to be voices in our professional associations, all of them. Whether it's a principals association, ministers association, teachers associations, we have to urge that our associations take strong stands for accountability 2.0. I think finally, we have to engage business leadership. Give them a copy of the test that your students take. Ask them to take it. And then ask them, are we measuring what matters most here? No, we're not. So the more you can help them to understand this need for accountability 2.0, strictly in the terms of, all right, are we measuring the skills that matter to you as a business leader? If not, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to go to the state with us? We can't do it by ourselves. You know, most people don't understand we got accountability 1.0 from business leadership. Lou Gerstner, chairman and CEO of IBM. David Kearns, CEO of Xerox. They called for a national summit on education in 1996 because they were worried about lack of skills. You know how many educators came to that national summit? 5, and only as observers. That's how we got where we are. The standards movement became No Child Left Behind, became, you know. My point is, accountability 1.0 was developed in spite of educators and often at their expense. Accountability 2.0 has to be a different kind of team effort, but we can't do it without business advocacy at a local, state, and national level. What else we got here? How does it look in an elementary school? How many of you have been to a Reggio Emilia classroom? Raise your hands. Montessori, raise your hands. You know the answer then. It's already there. Good Montessori classrooms, not all. Most Reggio Emilia classrooms I've ever been in look like high-tech high at the elementary level. I'm not kidding. We know how to do good elementary education. So often I think testing gets in the way. We're teaching to the test, not doing the good elementary education. We know, in fact, how to do it. Research has shown for most of a century. Let's see, what do you got? 1 or 2 more left, I think, maybe. Well, perhaps you squashed down and oppressed by VODE and their insane standardized tests. Did you have feelings about that? I can't tell by the way that's worded. Well, I think I've tried to already answer that. I gather there's a new leadership at Virginia DOE that is much more receptive to these ideas, that there's going to be pilots of different kinds of performance-based assessments like the pilot in New Hampshire. I think we have to continue to highlight that, advocate for it, explain why we're doing it, why it's important, and vote. You know, talk to your congressman, talk to your state senator. Go make an appointment to talk about these issues. I'm serious. We have to become advocates in every domain. Let's see, what else we got? Type of innovation are often in the middle. Yeah, I did that one. You know, standardized assessment, I think part of the challenge is to, sure, we have to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, right? So we have to acknowledge the SOLs aren't going away tomorrow, and we have to really be very strategic in studying that content knowledge. All my kids used to have to take standardized tests when I was a high school teacher. So I'd stop classes for a week. Stop classes, but I'd say, okay, we're not doing English this week. We're gonna learn how to take tests. And I'm gonna introduce you to some tests from last year, and you're gonna better understand, and that was legal, you're gonna better understand how to be a good test taker. And we're gonna look at and better understand the content knowledge you have to have. But so often, if you've taught kids to read critically, they're gonna figure out that at least 2 of the 4 answers don't qualify, and then they got a 50-50 chance, right? Which is way better than 1 in 4. So if we've taught kids to read critically and to think about what they're reading, they're going to do fine on most of those tests. Now, math is another problem, and I don't want to get editorializing on that. But the short version is I'm deeply concerned with the kind of advanced math we expect all kids to master. It's the #1 cause of high school dropouts. Did you know that, advanced math? And raise your hands if you're not a math person. Raise your hands if you've solved a quadratic equation in the last week. Or even just solved for x. Come on, show me a hand. Go ahead, I dare you. On the other hand, statistics, probability, computation, estimation, financial literacy, absolutely indispensable. So to me, this is a perfect example of all the things that we are testing that are wrong and what we ought to be assessing instead. I think I've about used up my welcome, if not my time. Let me stop here because I know we're already behind. I'm going to end with the questions, but I want to end on another note. As you may know, I'm a recovering high school English teacher, and I mean that in a good way. I miss it. I still think of this as a larger class. But you know, English teachers are fond of quoting literature, and I haven't done any all morning. So here goes. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. You remember that, right? Kurt Vonnegut, yeah? I mention this because you know all of the ways, you know better than I do, all of the ways in which these are very challenging times. You live it. But it may be less clear to you that it is also, I think, the best of times. I have the rare, extraordinary privilege of going all over the country and meeting outstanding educators like yourselves who are asking the right questions, who are offering real leadership, framing the big challenges, encouraging their teachers to take thoughtful, responsible risks, encouraging more play, more passion, and more purpose in the classroom. So I simply want to thank you, thank your district for extraordinary leadership. I want to thank you for what you do in your schools. I want to thank you above all for what you do for kids every single day. Thank you very much.